Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Give me one moment. Does this look okay? Can you see it?
Perfect. Perfect.
Good. Well, I want to start by thanking you all for the invitation to participate in the speaker series. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank you for attending this talk. I know there are many other things you could be doing with yourself, particularly on a Friday afternoon. So with that having been said, I am going to be discussing a project aimed at examining two strategies for reducing racial disparities and criminal court case outcomes using a cumulative case outcomes approach, which I'll explain along the way. Oh, let's see here. I am going to, here's what I'm going to do. This is going to be a rather long presentation. I'm going to try to get through this in about 40 minutes. And in this 40 minutes, what I want to do is talk about two solutions for reducing racial ethnic disadvantage in criminal courts. The two strategies I'm talking about are increased minority representation in courts and, more recently, the election of reformist or progressive prosecutors. These reformist prosecutors have campaigned on platforms aimed at reducing mass incarceration and racial disparities. So in a sense, I'll be assessing whether they are effective in achieving those goals. I'm also going to talk about case processing in Florida as relevant background for this assessment, and then finally talk about the results and conclusions. I'm actually going to do more on the front end than the back end because the results are pretty straightforward. Okay, so with all that having been said, let me dive right in and talk about a persistent problem in U.S. courts and really courts throughout much of the Western world. And that problem is persistent evidence of racial and ethnic disadvantage in court outcomes, particularly sentencing outcomes. And that's a key part of this work today. Is I'm going to use a cumulative case approach that goes beyond just looking at sentencing outcomes, because sentencing outcomes are a small sample of a wider case processing system that doles out sanctions even before you get to the sentence. Traditionally, the way U.S. courts have tried to handle the problem of disparity, whether it's racial, ethnic, gender, geographic, was to implement sentencing guidelines. And these sentencing guidelines were designed to structure judicial discretion in sentencing outcomes, but evaluations of sentencing outcomes and their effect on disparities have found they have only limited success at best. And that shouldn't be surprising because sentencing guidelines focus only on the last part of the sentencing process, of the case processing process, and it only targets one type of discretion, namely that of judges. It doesn't affect the discretion of prosecutors, which at least in the United States has grown substantially in the last 50 or so years, which I can talk about later if you would like. So the first alternative method to sentencing guidelines that's been touted in many quarters is increasing minority representation among court actors as a means to achieving greater racial fairness. For example, in 1968, the Kerner report, a U.S. report issued on protests and riots in the United States, often sparked by police actions. The Kerner report stated, police departments should intensify their efforts to recruit more Negroes. That's their term. It also said, Black officers increase insight into ghetto problems, and contact with Negro officers can help to avoid stereotypes and prejudices in the minds of white officers. More recently, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing asserted that diverse workforces, quote, improve understanding and effectiveness in dealing with all communities. And more recently still, the Fair and Just Prosecution Organization in 2018 called for hiring diverse workforces as, quote, a means to change office culture and practices toward greater fairness. So this is a tactic that's been around, been discussed for a long time, and is still touted as a potential pathway toward greater racial fairness. Theoretically, this makes some sense. At the individual level, minority court actors are less likely to hold or act upon racial biases, whether it's explicit or implicit. And this explanation comports very well with attribution theories, probably most famously focal concerns perspective, because this broad set of attribution theories posit that minority disadvantage is linked to court actors being influenced by negative cultural stereotypes depicting minorities as threats. And individual minority members are less likely to have those kind of cultural stereotypes embedded in their brains, although a non-trivial number do have those kind of cultural stereotypes. And at the group level, the work group, and here work group is a bit of jargon that is a term that refers to stable groups of court actors, imagine a courtroom, who continuously work together on various cases. So these work groups that contain minority members are more likely to discuss and be cognizant of overzealous sanctions, racial inequalities in those sanctions, and work toward obtaining more appropriate and egalitarian outcomes. On the other hand, there are reasons to doubt minority representation as a solution to persistent racial inequalities. Probably most notably, the institutional bias and community court perspective suggests that minority representation may not be enough to overcome the institutional practices that lead to racial disparities. So probably the clearest example I could give you of this is in the United States. Criminal history is one of the two most powerful predictors of sentence severity and case outcomes. But because there are practices in communities, some would say targeting minority communities, it leads to minority defendants having greater levels of prior criminal history. So if your institution weights prior criminal conduct as a factor, that practice will institutionalize racial biases and racial disadvantage in court action. Further, the community court perspective says discretionary powers of individuals and even groups, work groups, are constrained by organizational rules and hierarchies of authority. Chief prosecutor, the presiding judge of the jurisdiction. All these hierarchies of authorities constrain the ability of individual actors and even work groups to affect egalitarian outcomes. This leads to another potential solution to racial biases. That second solution is electing progressive reformist chief prosecutors. I've just written a paper with Nick Peterson and Chi Yan, and one of the things we did in this paper is try to assess how many progressive prosecutors have been elected in the United States by examining the 100 largest, most populous counties in the United States. And we found 41% of those counties had elected at some point in the last 20 years a progressive prosecutor, and most of them are still in office. And these reformist progressive prosecutors, they campaigned on ending mass incarceration by getting rid of, or more accurately, reducing the use of some of the draconian practices that led to mass incarceration, and eliminating racial disparities in prison populations and those sent to prisons. And there's a whole bunch of mechanisms they use to achieve these goals, but some of the primary mechanisms are to institute broad policies that categorically decline prosecution for certain offenses, whether they're sex work, low-level drug possession, low-level theft. They try to move away from using cash bail. They're more likely to implement draconian sentences like mandatory minimums or the death penalty. And in these ways, they hope to achieve their two goals of ending mass incarceration and reducing racial disparity. This is an important and very different intervention. Unlike previous efforts to control racial disparities by eliminating discretion of court actors, this second strategy positively relies on discretion, the discretion of chief prosecutors to achieve the goals of reducing incarceration rates and racial disparities. And this may be an effective solution because chief prosecutors control a whole host of outcomes, a whole host of processes that could change a jurisdiction's policies and practices. For instance, they control the hiring, firing, and training of line prosecutors who actually do the work of prosecuting individual cases. They control the assignment of line prosecutors' cases. They control the policies and practices that guide line prosecutors in their decision making. They supervise these line prosecutors and, at least in theory, make sure that line prosecutors and their decision making adheres to the office policies. Again, theoretically, this solution has considerable theoretical evidence to support that it may work. For example, the court community perspective notes that local courts establish their own substantive rationalities that define who and when sanctions will be deployed. And these substantive rationalities are key drivers in determining case outcomes and the process used. So progressive prosecutors, they could radically change these local substantive rationalities in their hiring practices, in their policy-making practices, so on and so forth. And if they are effective, this might lead to systematic differences, systematic variations in case outcomes and sanctioning by jurisdiction. So those are the two strategies I'm going to be assessing. Now, before I actually get into the how I will be assessing them and the results of this assessment, I want to take a few minutes to talk about case processing in the state of Florida, where I will be examining these issues. The first thing to know about case processing in Florida is there are 20 judicial districts in Florida. Each of these 20 judicial districts has its own elected chief prosecutor. Most of these jurisdictions are comprised of several counties, but some of the larger, more populous counties like Miami-Dade and Hillsborough, that's Miami and Tampa respectively, have their own judicial district that is one county. So each district elects its own prosecutor, and those prosecutors, as I said, are very influential and powerful. In terms of the case processing itself, there are three distinct stages in case processing. The first stage is the complaint stage. This is where police, and I should mention all these are felonies. The first stage is the complaint stage where police make a felony arrest. They recommend the initial charges to prosecutors. And in this stage, those charges are filed. The judge reviews them to make sure there's enough probable cause to support the arrest and the charges. And bail is determined. And importantly, bail in Florida and just about all of the counties, all of the judicial districts is controlled by a bail schedule. The most important phase of the case, and I can prove this empirically, is the information stage. Approximately 30 days after initial complaint is filed, the line prosecutor assigned to that case decides whether to file charges as a felony by filing an information. So that term information stage really refers to whether the prosecutor is going to continue to pursue the charges listed in their original complaint as felonies, and if so, they file a felony information. They can also reduce the charges to a misdemeanor, and it goes down to a misdemeanor court. They can divert from prosecution the case entirely, basically saying if you complete this term of supervision led by prosecutors, the charges will go away, or they can dismiss the case entirely. So when you think about it, that's 4 different outcomes right there: dismissal, diversion, reduced to misdemeanor, or continue to pursue the case as a felony. I say this is the most important stage because almost every case in which prosecutors file a felony information, the defendant is convicted of some crime. And when I say almost every case, I'm talking about more than 95%, probably like 97, 98% of cases with the felony information filed are or will be convicted of some criminal offense at the next stage, the adjudication stage. Importantly, in Florida, the plea agreement struck by prosecutors and defense attorneys specify not only the type of sanction to be imposed, but the length of the sanction. In other words, in effect, these plea agreements sentence individuals in Florida. It's not actually a judge. The judge simply signs off on the plea agreement, and they almost always sign off on the plea agreement. So in a sense, prosecutors who control plea agreements and plea bargaining have substantial effect on sentencing in Florida through these plea bargains. Excuse me. In most places in the United States, it is notoriously difficult to obtain data on pretrial decision making, like the first 2 stages, the complaint and information stages. We typically only have data on the sentencing stage, the 3rd stage here. And this makes it exceedingly difficult to study prosecutorial decision making and pretrial decision making more generally. Florida, however, has expansive open records laws known as sunshine laws that make these court documents public record. And to comply with these laws, county clerks, court clerks, make court records available on their websites. You can find the documents that I can show you online. This right here is a redacted version of a complaint. I redacted this information. If I hadn't redacted this information, you would have seen the defendant's name, his date of birth, where he lives. This individual happens to be transient, homeless. This complaint document lists the charges against the defendant. You can see here toward the top, possession of a controlled substance is the felony charge here. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see this, but toward the bottom, it states what the circumstances around this arrest. This homeless individual was stopped by police and city of St. Petersburg. He had approximately 0.8 grams of a substance known as spice. It's a synthetic cannabinoid. And he was arrested for that felony offense of having 0.8 grams, 0.8 of a gram, very small amount. This is the criminal complaint. Based on this criminal complaint and information in it, bail is set. This person was not able to make bail. I believe his bail was $2,000. He waited in jail while prosecutors decided whether or not to charge this case as a felony by filing this next document, a felony information. They decided to continue to prosecute this case as a felony, 3rd-degree felony, which is at the lowest level of felonies in the state of Florida. I've redacted some information here, including the defendant's name, but it also lists who the prosecuting attorneys are in this case. So I can tell from this document and other documents not only who the defendant is, but who the judge is, who the prosecutor is, who the defense attorney is. Using that information, I coded the background of who these people are, their age, race, gender, so on and so forth. We'll talk about that process in a moment. But these documents contain that information. Another very important document, also available publicly on the internet, It's a judgment and sentence. This gentleman received a sentence of 15 months in prison for simple possession of synthetic cannabinoid known as spice. He primarily received this prison sentence, because he had extensive and rather serious criminal history, including a robbery conviction, a burglary conviction. In my example, a 15-month sentence for simple possession of 0.8 grams of synthetic cannabinoid is an example of the unhinged sentence severity evident in many places in the United States. To go a little further into how sentences are derived in Florida, it's a little bit different than most places. Sentencing in Florida is guided by the Criminal Punishment Code, which uses a point system instead of a two-dimensional grid, which is standard, or three-dimensional grid, standard in many places in the United States that have sentencing guidelines. And the way this works is just about every aspect of a crime is scored. It's given a number of points, and all the points are added up to a variable called total sentence points. And the lowest permissible sentence in a case is determined by total sentence points. If your total sentence points is more than 44 points, you're supposed to be sentenced to prison. And if it's less than or equal to 44 points, you're supposed to be given a community sanction. As I show you in a moment, the lowest permissible sentence, the total sentence points also determines the length of a prison sentence if you have more than 44 points. However, one mind-blowing provision in sentencing in Florida is it allows for mitigated departures for uncoerced plea bargains. Now, I could say this is a really wild provision because almost every conviction involves an uncoerced plea bargain. What I'm saying to you is prosecutors in the state of Florida, if they can strike a plea bargain with the defendant, and they almost always do, they have the power to recommend a sentence below the lowest permissible sentence at their discretion. The court also permits adjudication to be withheld. In other words, a person can be found guilty of an offense, but that conviction will be withheld for a period of time, typically a year, 18 months, 2 years. And as long as they stay out of trouble and abide by their conditions, the conviction will be permanently held in abeyance. It's like they've never convicted. This process of sentencing is documented in this document right here. This is the Criminal Punishment Code score sheet. And I'm showing you this handwritten document. This is a different case than the one I was talking about just a moment ago. And I'll show you why I use a different case in just a second. But this person was convicted of robbery by sudden snatching. I believe he snatched a purse or a wallet from someone he was with. You can see that offense has 28 points. That's what the score is. He had a prior criminal conviction of burglary of a dwellings toward the bottom, a second-degree felony, 14 points. He had another 28 points there. So he had 56 points on this page. Going to the next page, a score of 56 points is high enough to have the lowest permissible sentence as a prison sentence. There's a formula here, and based on this formula, he was supposed to receive 13 and a half months in prison as a sanction. But if you look at the bottom, his actual sentence imposed was a county jail sentence of time served of 3 days. So listen to what I'm telling you. He was supposed to receive 13 and a half months in prison, but instead he received a sentence of 3 days, which he had already served. How is it possible that he went from having a 13 and a half month sentence to 3 days? It's because at the very bottom it says mitigated departure plea bargain. Those what those X's say down here at the bottom. So prosecutors agreed to give him a sentence of time served 3 days instead of 13 and a half months, which the Criminal Punishment Code called for in this case. This is an example of the extreme power and discretion prosecutors have in the state of Florida. Okay, so putting this all together, what this means is there are 7 case outcomes that are common for felony cases. The first case outcome, and in many ways the least punitive, is for the case to be declined altogether. All charges dismissed, case does not go forward. Second, your case can be diverted to a lower court, misdemeanor court, which rarely hands out jail sentences, particularly long jail sentences. You can have your case diverted from prosecution. And in many ways, this might actually be a lower, less punitive sanction than transferring to a lower court. However, if you fail on diversion, you can have your case prosecuted further, and you could end up in prison in some cases. So first three case outcomes: declination, transfer, diversion. These are all pretrial outcomes. The last 4 outcomes are post-adjudication outcomes. These are things that happen after you've been convicted. The first option is you can have your adjudication withheld. Next, you can receive a probation sentence, a jail sentence, or a prison sentence. These are the outcomes, the cumulative outcomes that felony cases in Florida have as their possible outcomes. So this is a cumulative case outcome. We're not focusing just on the last stages. We're focusing on the whole case from beginning to end. In particular, what we did in this project is we took a random sample, 5% random sample of all cases filed in 65 counties. That's all but 2 very small counties in the year 2017. We coded nearly 12,000 cases, and after some exclusions, we had 11,414 cases. We coded these and obtained the data through those publicly available websites that I talked about a second ago. Florida also makes public data on prior criminal history. We linked that criminal history to each case to figure out how much criminal history each defendant had. For the court actors listed in the forms, we coded demographic information on them. Through this process, we were able to measure which court actors are minorities and which court groups had minority actors in them. We linked the names, identities of the court actors to the Florida bar website. We also linked them to voter records, both of which contain self-reported demographic data. Yes, voter records are public record in Florida. And when those 2 information sources failed, we looked for social media of court actors, and we coded their perceived race, ethnicity from these pictures. We only did this for individuals who appeared frequently in the work group. People who infrequently appeared were excluded because they are not part of the relatively stable work group in a case. So this is what we've done. This is how we collected our data. What did we find? Well, in regards to the first strategy, we found very limited diversity in the work group. Judges were 91% white, 3% black, 5.5% Hispanic. Prosecutors were a bit more diverse, 84% white. And in total, 88% of the work group was all white. 88% was white. And most of the work groups were all white. I didn't put on here defense attorneys, but they were also largely white. In terms of analyses, we use multi-level regression analyses to control for the work group, case characteristics, and I'll show you some of those case characteristics in a couple of slides here. And we regressed the case characteristic and work group characteristics on our 7 outcomes using multinomial logistic regression. What we found is work group diversity and even individual minority status of court actors does not matter. First of all, what we found is there isn't strong evidence of racial disparities in sentencing outcomes generally. For Black defendants, there was evidence they were less likely to receive probation sentences and more likely to receive prison sentences than white defendants. For Hispanic defendants, there were no statistically significant disparities that disadvantaged Hispanics. In terms of the work group characteristics, they didn't predict case outcomes. So the racial composition of the work group, increasing minority representation, had no statistically significant effect on case outcomes. Individual racial ethnic status also had no effect, even when used in combination with the racial composition of the work group. So in other words, defendants of various races and ethnicities, their case outcomes were not dependent on the racial diversity of the work group, their attorney's race, the judge's race, their race, in combination with the work group. It just simply didn't matter systematically in any of our analyses. So work group diversity doesn't matter for this sample of cases. So I'm moving on for time considerations here. I'll be happy to answer more questions about that first set of results. Moving on to assessing the effect of progressive prosecutors. We use the same basic approach. And this second assessment, it's not much different here, although because we did find statistically significant interactions, we applied best practices and testing those interactions following the work of Mize and others. And here's the descriptive statistics. These actually are descriptive statistics for the whole sample, so I probably should have shown you this before, but I wanted to hold it off until now because I wanted to show you the percentage of cases that were handled by progressive prosecutors for each racial group. Before I get down to the bottom, which is highlighted in red, I want to point out in the middle of the graph, it talks about number of prior felony convictions. You'll see the group with the largest number of prior felony convictions are African American. The lowest is actually Hispanics. This is important because prior felony convictions, prior sentence points, is one of two drivers of sentences and case outcomes in the state of Florida. In the very middle of the graph of this chart here is offense seriousness points. This is a quantitative measure of the offense seriousness, which I showed you from the documents. Again, African Americans had greater average total sentence points than whites. What's different here is Hispanics now have the most serious, largest mean number of offense seriousness points. This is important because it shows you it's really important to control for these factors in the regression analyses because there are racial differences in these key components, key predictors. At the bottom, you'll see that minority defendants, especially Hispanics, are much more likely to be prosecuted in a jurisdiction with a progressive prosecutor. There were 4 progressive prosecutors in our data. They were all in large cities in Florida, in Miami-Dade, in the Tampa area, Hillsborough County, in Orlando, Orange County, and in Jacksonville. So in urban areas in the state, particularly large metropolitan areas, they had progressive prosecutors. And I can talk to you about how we determine who's a progressive prosecutor a little bit later, but I'm gonna move forward for time consideration. The first thing we found is that there are stark differences and case outcomes depending on whether you have a progressive or conventional prosecutor. Progressive prosecutors were much more likely to dismiss, transfer, divert a case. While none of these differences individually are statistically significant, if you add the probabilities of dismissal, transfer, and diversion, what you find is progressive prosecutors were more likely to not file a felony information in comparison to conventional chief prosecutors. They're also less likely to impose probation sentences and jail sentences, and more likely to impose jail sentences, often jail sentences of time served. In other words, across most measures, progressive prosecutors were less punitive than conventional prosecutors. In terms of racial disparities, what we find in jurisdictions with conventional chief prosecutors is there were no disparities between whites and Hispanics. The same thing is generally true in progressive jurisdictions, except for in progressive jurisdictions, Hispanics were less likely to receive prison sentences than whites. So in Florida, Hispanics are not generally disadvantaged on average, and it doesn't depend on whether you have a conventional chief prosecutor or a progressive chief prosecutor. By contrast, for African Americans, it does matter which type of prosecutor you have. In jurisdictions, and most jurisdictions have conventional prosecutors, African Americans are disadvantaged in the probation stage, less likely to get probation, more likely to get prison. Progressive jurisdictions, there are no statistically significant differences between whites and blacks. And that difference, let me see here. The difference I take that back. There's one statistically significant difference. African Americans were less likely to receive probation than whites, but that disparity is much smaller than the disparity evident in conventional jurisdiction. So that's the one statistically significant difference, and it's barely statistically significant. So what we find overall is there are a few differences between whites and Hispanics. Black defendants are disadvantaged in post-adjudication outcomes, prison and probation, but not in the pretrial outcomes. Progressive prosecutors reduced the size of these disparities, and there are actually very few disparities, particularly in the pretrial outcomes relative to conventional ones. And there wasn't evidence of Black disadvantage in prison sentences in jurisdictions with progressive chief prosecutors, but there was a disadvantage in that outcome for jurisdictions with conventional chief prosecutors. And as I mentioned before, the Black disadvantage in probation outcomes was narrowed in progressive jurisdiction. Summarizing conclusions here, work group diversity simply did not predict case outcomes or disparities therein. Progressive prosecutors, by contrast, were less punitive and exhibited greater racial fairness in their case outcomes than traditional chief prosecutors. This suggests that electing progressive chief prosecutors may be an effective means of reducing both mass incarceration and racial disparities in prison populations. I've been talking at you for 40 solid minutes, so I'm going to stop here and take your questions. I appreciate you and your time. So, questions?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
That was great.
Stop sharing this.
I have a couple questions, but maybe I'll just open it up to sort of the virtual room if people want to start. Can't tell if people are clapping or if those are hands. So maybe I'll start and people can think about it. So thanks so much for that. So you mentioned that progressive prosecutors often kind of campaign on a series of policies that they'd like to change. This is outside of your data, obviously, but do you get a sense that some of them seem very ambitious? I mean, have they been successful in actually changing policies, or has it just been more kind of interpersonal pressure, expectations, the culture of the room kind of thing when you have a progressive prosecutor? So is it the culture that a progressive prosecutor brings with them, or is it the policy changes that they're able to kind of introduce?
I think it's both.
Right.
There's a difference in the culture. I can't measure that in an objective manner, but from interviews, and I should mention we did interviews with these chief prosecutors. From our interviews, they talked about how they want to change the culture of their offices as well as the policies. What I can measure is the outcome of the policies. And in the paper that we're writing right now, we compare and contrast the policies between jurisdictions with progressive and conventional chief prosecutors. There are some differences, but we can more clearly measure the outcomes of those policies. Progressive prosecutors are much more likely to not file felony information than conventional prosecutors, and they're less likely to use more punitive sentences like prison sentencing. So I think it's a bit of both.
Thank you. Other questions, if people have hands, or if Jeff has any questions from the YouTube, or else I'm just going to dominate, which I try not to do. Okay, I will ask another question then. And this is more of a politics question. As a Canadian, kind of watching the politics of these issues in the United States for quite some time now, I've always been surprised that prosecutors get a pass politically. That all of the issues around racial disparities in prison and the prosecutors in public culture are almost never mentioned. And it just seems surprising to me that given what we know about the power that they have in the kind of producing the inequities that you've been talking about, that they just don't seem to be singled out as a matter of concern. I mean, does that map onto your experiences? And if so, well, how might we explain that?
I would agree that prior to the progressive prosecution moment, most Americans were unaware of the tremendous power of chief prosecutors, and they did get a pass. And part of the reason it's so easy to give them a pass is we don't have systematic data in many places and for many years on this discretionary decision-making of prosecutors. So the public and even researchers weren't fully aware of how much power prosecutors have. But since about 2015, when the progressive prosecution movement really started to gain momentum, there has been increased emphasis and understanding of the power of chief prosecutors. So I think it's still a bit under-recognized, but there's much more recognition today, and prosecutors, particularly in large urban areas, populous areas, aren't getting that pass anymore. It's understood that they and their decisions are key drivers of mass incarceration and racial disparities in prison populations. And that's part of the reason that you see so many places electing progressive prosecutors.
So we have a question from L'Oreal. It says, thank you for your talk, Dr. Mitchell. I may have missed this, but can you talk more about how you measured progressive versus conventional prosecutors?
Yeah, I forgot to put this slide in here, but there were four criteria that we used to distinguish progressive prosecutors. The first one was whether they removed poverty traps, like trying to reduce the influence of cash bail, trying to reduce fines and fees and the like, whether they campaigned on reducing racial disparities. What am I forgetting? We basically coded for every prosecutor in the state their campaign promises, and the ones that campaigned on platforms consistent with progressive prosecution movement were the ones that we classified as progressive prosecutors. So it was bail, it was moving poverty traps, it was removing or reducing racial disparities, and one that is escaping me at the moment. But they all had those four criteria met. In the paper that came out on this issue, we used 3 out of the 4, but they actually all met 4 out of the 4. So hopefully I answered that question.
Thank you. So we have a question from Ashley. Hello, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak at all to the impact of private paid lawyers compared to those with legal aid representation. What I'm wondering where does class economic conditions factor or intersect with race and court outcomes?
So let me take the first part of that question. How does having a paid attorney affect case processing outcomes? And this wasn't necessarily apparent in this presentation, but we did control for the type of attorney a person had, whether it was paid or a state attorney. And what we find is having a paid attorney doesn't make much difference in the post adjudication stages, stages 4 through 7. But they do make a difference in the pretrial outcomes. They're less likely, excuse me, yeah, I said that right. They're less likely to have their cases filed as felony information, more likely to get it dismissed, more likely to have it diverted. And, that makes sense because public attorneys essentially work through triage. They have so many cases that they don't actually do a whole lot of investigation before the felony information has been filed. And by that point, it's a done deal that they're going to be convicted. Whereas the private attorneys, they can invest more time and energy in investigating the case while it's still in the information stage and lobby the prosecuting attorney for certain outcomes, like diversion. For the felony information, private attorneys make a difference in the pre-adjudication stage, but they don't have much of an effect on the post-adjudication stage. In that way, economic conditions affect cases. So I would actually say the bigger impact of economic forces, however, is on the ability to make bail. People who make bail systematically receive less punitive case outcomes than people who are not able to make bail. So in two ways, economic factors, at least two ways, economic factors affect case outcomes through making bail and through the ability to hire private attorneys. I hope I was able to answer that question fully.
Thank you. So, Reg, one of our students asked, this is obviously a question that's particularly paramount in Alberta and Canada generally. So thank you for your talk, Dr. Mitchell. I was wondering if you had any information or data related to white versus Aboriginal representation. I'm not sure if that applies to Florida. Yeah.
It does apply to Florida. Florida is the site, the home of the Seminole Nation. Florida has a non-trivial Indigenous Aboriginal community. Our data do not consistently record those racial groups. In fact, we didn't have consistent data on Hispanic ethnicity, despite the fact that a large proportion of people living in the state of Florida are of Hispanic culture and origin. So what we had to do is apply a name database to figure out who is Hispanic. And that way we were able to figure out who's Hispanic. I mentioned all of this to say that race data recorded by the courts is very poor. But even if it had been better, only a small percentage of defendants in our sample were Aboriginal, to use your term. Yeah. And it was too small for us to do any real analysis. So one of the things I mentioned in the methods part is we coded almost 12,000 cases, but our effective sample was 11,414. And part of that, the exclusions were racial groups who were so small that we couldn't conduct meaningful analysis. So unfortunately, I can't bring empirical evidence to bear on the question of white versus Aboriginal designations and its influence on case outcomes.
I mean, just before I get to Phil, I just want to say as a Canadian, it does blow me away the comparative ease of access to information on these things, because it doesn't map onto the Canadian situation very well. So Phil,
I hear that.
Yeah.
I hear that every year at the Western Society of Criminology's meetings about how difficult it is to obtain data, particularly race data, and criminal justice settings in Canada.
So maybe I'll just make Phil the last question, because we have a team meeting immediately following this, so we have to get the technology up for. So this is Dr. Phil Badway. So my question is about one of the conclusions stating that progressive chief prosecutors exhibit greater racial fairness than conventional chief prosecutors. In the slide examining case outcomes, black versus white, there appears to be significant difference between the races for both conventional and progressive chief prosecutors. Is this being considered as more racial fairness when there are still racial differences?
Yeah, so one of the things, I forgot, I'm not sharing my screen anymore, is we weren't looking necessarily for perfectly race neutral outcomes. Uh, that would be great, but what we were really trying to assess is whether there there's smaller racial differences, racial disadvantages based on the two strategies employed. So the conclusion that progressive prosecutors achieved greater racial fairness was based on two factors. First and foremost, there were no racial disparities disadvantaging African Americans and the prison sentence outcome, very important. And while they weren't able to completely eliminate racial disparities in probation, those disparities were smaller than those of conventional jurisdictions, those with conventional chief prosecutors. So the answer is a bit of yes to both components. There are smaller differences and there are no differences on certain important outcomes.
Excellent. So maybe everyone will just join me virtually, thanking Professor Mitchell for the talk. Thank you very much. That was great. And thank you for taking your time on I'm not sure what time it is for you currently. I'm not sure physically where you are, but it's kind of afternoon here in Edmonton. So thank you. And I'm sure if people have follow-ups, they know how to get in touch with you. Much appreciated.
Be happy to answer any questions. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
And for the other people in the group, we have another different Zoom link that's circulated. I'll see everyone in a couple.